I've just seen two rival interpretations of a stunt by Greenpeace that took place a few days ago. If you don't know about this, basically a group of their activists, for want of a better term, targeted Rishi Sunak's private residence, which I assume is in his Richmond constituency in North Yorkshire. It's a mansion, okay, but it's a private residence. Now, before I get into this, whatever people think of the Prime Minister's wealth or, Prime Ministers having private residences or any of that, um, it is what it is. It's a private residence. And if you are of the opinion that it's valid because of his job, then you'd have to extend that and say, well, it's valid for any powerful public figure. You know, the principle here is you can't have it both ways and say that it's valid because he's the prime minister, but if it was, for example, targeting Starmer, which they might well do actually, because Starmer certainly hasn't been in their good books recently either, with Labour's position on the oil issue in the North Sea and the oil drilling issue. Um, Greenpeace is a lot older than the other organisations I've mentioned in these sort of videos, and it's much, much older than just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or Insulate Britain. I think it was founded unless I'm mistaken, in the late 70s. So it's quite an old organisation, and it's a very well-funded organisation, probably very well organised. I've never had much time for it. I think they're probably a bit smarter insofar as they're not stupid enough to directly aggravate the public. So Greenpeace does tend to focus more directly on energy plants and so on. They don't directly engage in blocking roads against the public. Incidentally, before it passes my attention, there's another group called This Is Rigged, I believe they're calling themselves, and they targeted a cycle competition in Scotland. I believe it was between Edinburgh and the Highlands. I could be wrong about that, but regardless, it was a cycling event. Cycling event. I mean, literally an event that promotes a healthy activity. No pollution, and they target that. The police made arrests, and luckily no one was injured. But those are the sort of stunts that it could have put the cyclists at risk if they came out onto the road with their banner. The cyclists are forced to stop. You can imagine the situation. Thankfully, that didn't transpire. But they'll probably start getting more attention now. It's like each year a new group sort of emerges. Um, my own feelings on the North Sea issue are divided. I'm not sure that we could just have this endless sort of situation where there's endless exploration of oil and gas, but I also think it is very, very important to look at the current situation and jobs. These are people's livelihoods. That's not a trivial issue. But it's like the video I made about climate change. I think they're complex issues, and I'm not going to pretend that I know more about this subject than I do, because I don't. I think it's okay. I think it's valid to be humble enough to say, actually, these are not black and white issues. There's a lot of factors involved. There's job security involved. There is ecological protection involved. There's a lot of issues involved. Sustainability. But anyway, to get to the two sides of this, so what they've done is they targeted Sunak's house, and they unveiled a big black drip, obviously meant to represent oil. Now, they had, and I've seen this in other Greenpeace stunts, they had like scaffolding equipment, they had high visibility jackets, which are apparently oil based. The irony of it. Um, you can tell by the tone of my voice, I don't support this sort of stunt. I think that a private residence, it's crossing a line. It's like targeting a politician's family. Now, what happened is a representative from GB News then decided to give them a taste of their own medicine, and he found the residence of their CEO, and she was confronted. And he basically went into their headquarters, very, cushy looking building, I might add, very polished, very clean, very modern looking. Be interesting to know what sort of energy supplies they use. But anyway, he confronted them about their hypocrisy. about the fact that they felt it okay to target someone's private residence. And the irony was, he said, and it was clearly intended to be provocative, but he said, "Oh, thank you for inviting us." And she was on the defense. "Oh, but we didn't." I said, "The irony of this." So, it really was a taste of their own medicine. I'm going to put a link to that video now. From GB News, I don't necessarily agree with the direction of GB News. I think sometimes they do kind of resemble Britain's Fox in some ways. But I won't lie, I found it quite refreshing to see eco-zealots get a taste of their own medicine. But, lo and behold, there was yet another perspective. Novara Media, which is a decidedly left-wing source, then had a video talking about GB News reporter storms Greenpeace headquarters. Storms. Well, I watched the video, there was no storming. He wasn't invited, but he wasn't violent, he wasn't aggressive, he wasn't using profanities, he wasn't, vandalizing anything. He did ask them blunt questions, and he did hold them to account for their hypocrisy. Um, and the fact that they're being paid a lot of money. It's not a grassroots movement. He brought up the thing about, why are you not doing this in China? Now, some would say that's a redundant question. They claim that there is a big movement in China. I don't know if Greenpeace is active in China as they claim. I'm not sure if that holds up to scrutiny or not. I'm sure there's environmental movements in China against, certainly in their cities. I know there's been documentaries made about the chronic pollution in Chinese cities. But this is, I think, become, I don't want to say the latest battleground. It's been going on for a while, but it's certainly become a battleground in the culture wars. So, you have GB News, which is a right wing source, and Novara Media, which is a left wing source, and they're both given different perspectives. Like I say, I don't agree with everything GB News comes out with, but I do think Greenpeace are a bunch of hypocrites. They're predominantly middle class, and, how did they get to that site? Are we really to believe that they walked the whole way there? They would have, at least for part of the journey, have got some sort of public transport, a bus or something. They'll never admit it, of course. Um, but I think what people find very galling about this is, they're not a small organisation. They have close to 1 million supporters on their Facebook page. So it is important to stress that they are a different beast from, the likes of Just Stop Oil, which are universally despised. But the thing is about Greenpeace, they support Just Stop Oil. Their precise tactics may not be the same, so they're not necessarily directly aggravating the public. But you push a Greenpeace activist, and there's a wafer thin difference in their ideology, in their dystopian worldview, and they absolutely support the tactics of Just Stop Oil. They've been pushing out propaganda on Facebook about peaceful protests being cancelled, but I do find left wing hypocrisy in this rather galling. So, Just Stop Oil can make mess with people's lives. They can stop people getting to urgent medical appointments. They can disrupt sporting events. They can, yeah, mess with people's lives. Think it's okay to obnoxiously stand in the middle of roads and stop people going about their business. Oh no, that's peaceful protest. But when a reporter asks questions of a powerful CEO, a woman who has a lot of influence on the country's biggest environmental group, oh no, that's storming, that's wrong, that's aggressive. I mean, basically what Novara Media seem to be saying is Greenpeace is above reproach. And if they don't like the tactics, then why is that wrong? But Greenpeace adopting pretty much the same tactics is fine. It kind of sickens me, actually, the hypocrisy of it. And the way that, this middle class left wing faction just sneers at anyone who doesn't see the world the way they do. I think there is a sort of elitism going on there. Now, I'm not one to go on about class wars. And by the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with being middle class. So, you know, I don't think it's problematic, except insofar as very often, there's this notion that a lot of green activists are like watermelons. This has often been an analogy because they're green on the outside, red on the inside. You don't need to dig too far to see some pretty far left worldviews. Um, you know, where they would get into pretty hardline socialism. So there's a lot of overlapping there. And, we live in a free country. They're entitled to believe whatever they want, but it's there. And why does that matter? Well, if you look at these environmental organizations, I would say it's a fair comment to say that they're almost overwhelmingly from middle class backgrounds. There may be some working class components there, but overwhelmingly it is kind of ideological, polytechnic type, chattering classes, so to speak. Um, why is that significant? Because they would be the first people to rail about the plight of the poor and the how the working class are trod on and so on. Yet they're the ones who are stopping ordinary working people going about their business. For example, um, white collar, blue collar, excuse me, not white collar, blue collar workers getting to points of their contracts and so on. During the Insulate Britain protests, there was one guy that was actually going to fit insulation, and he was stopped getting to the site. So the people they're impacting, especially just Stop Oil, are not big, powerful corporations. It's ordinary people. That is what is so disgusting about their tactics. Um, and like I say, Greenpeace doesn't adopt exactly those tactics, but Greenpeace supports them. Greenpeace are basically cheerleaders for Just Stop Oil. If there was any difference, Greenpeace would use its position to say we agree with their ideology, but not their tactics. Instead, Greenpeace pushes out the false narrative that there's a generic attack on the right to protest. That is not the case. And if I ever felt that that was a policy that was being adopted by the British government, that all protest was being banned, I would be the first to be opposing it. I believe in the right to protest, but not the right to break the law. There is no right to break the law. It's the entitlement of these activists that I find so utterly, utterly obnoxious. And just one last point. They say when she was confronted, she didn't apologise, typically arrogant, but she claimed, oh, we knocked and nobody was at home to say who we were. Well, she sort of contradicted herself because she said that on one hand, they made sure nobody was at home. But what were they going to do if Sunak answered? Or his wife answered? I understand Sunak has two young daughters. You know, he's a relatively young man in his early 40s. He has a young family. Forget for a minute that he's the Prime Minister. That's, to me, it's crossing a line. It really is. And the fact that he's away doesn't make it any better. How is he to know that, who knows where he was in some cabinet meeting or, meeting an ambassador or whatever it is a prime minister would do on a daily basis? How is he to know that, they aren't vandalising his property as Just Stop Oil would do? So the fact that he wasn't there doesn't make it any better. The fact is they targeted a private residence, and then when it was turned on them, and incidentally, it's like I say, that residence, I don't know if it was the private property of the CEO or kind of their office, I'm not entirely sure about that, but it looked like a pretty comfortable building. They had modern lighting, and they were not living in some sort of hut, powered by some vegan friendly supply, or it's just, I really, really think that there is staggering hypocrisy with these groups, and I think it needs to be exposed a lot more. I'm sick and tired of them being normalised as protesters, because these are people who, is it really brave to take pride in constantly breaking the law? Or is it just self-aggrandizing? Bravery to me would be what dissidents are doing in Russia or in China or Iran. Bravery is an Iranian woman taking off her hijab. Bravery is a Russian opposition politician knowing he could spend year or she could spend years in jail. Bravery is an investigative journalist going up against the mob. Bravery is not a bunch of entitled eco warriors pulling off stunts for which, yes, they'll be arrested, but the vast majority of them won't go to jail. They'll just get a fine. And then that's no problem because they're funded by millionaires. So they're not a grassroots movement. Maybe Greenpeace started off that way. But this is the thing. They're all funded by millionaires. So there's a real elitism there, I believe. Um, I just have no time for them. And I really call on responsible environmentalists to recognise the optics of this. Now, in the grand scheme of stunts, draping, a black cloth over the Prime Minister's private residence, far from the worst thing. I think disrupting the public is disgusting. What Just Stop Oil do. Nevertheless, this stunt by Greenpeace, it's typical of them. And it's kind of like, well, a government spokesman said they've lost their place to be at the table. Well, why the hell should they? If they're going to engage in these sort of stunts, why should they be treated like adults? Why should they have a place on the negotiating table? So, to my mind, it's an own goal. If they really want to change anything, if they want to have a positive influence, they've just blown their chance. Of course, they and their supporters won't see it that way. They'll say, "Oh, how brave, how noble! We're sending out a message." But it's an echo chamber. I don't think they're changing anything. I mean, Greenpeace has existed for 40 plus years. Um, they might argue that they've made green issues, they've brought that to the centre. That may or may not be true. It is true that in politics, certainly green issues are a lot more central than they used to be. That is true. And, in the 2000s, David Cameron, some would say cynically, changed the Tories logo to a tree. I think that was a bit naff myself, but, to show the Tories were serious about green issues. But what bugs me about their worldview is the way they vilify this country. And actually, Britain has done more than a lot of other countries to reduce our net emissions. It's not perfect, it's not what they want. But really, when we look at global emitters, even if we do absolutely everything these groups are lobbying for, which would shatter the economy, but if we'd done it, it would not offset the global situation because countries like China, India, the United States, Australia, you know, they would, it just would make no difference in terms of global output. So I don't see how destroying our economy with some of the proposals that they're coming out with, I don't see how that is sustainable. Talking about future generations is all very well if you show contempt for the present generation. And I keep having to reiterate the point that I am not a climate change skeptic. I'm not one of these people that say, oh, it's all made up and there isn't, rising temperatures. I think that you can't ignore that there's a rising global population and that's going to have an impact on the planet. I think it's just common sense. But the the dystopian narrative that these groups are coming out with and their utter failure to do anything productive other than these stunts, I've just got no respect for them. So anyway, I'll put a link to that the GB News. I forget the reporter's name now, but he wasn't being aggressive; he was being blunt. There was a comical twist to it. He started making himself some tea. But this wasn't like he stormed in. They make it sound like it was some sort of far right militia group. I mean, I'm talking about Novara Media now. Incidentally, by talking about this, I've probably blown my chance for any job with them as a freelance journalist. Someone who's trained in freelance journalism, I need to get my break. Well, I've probably just blown it. So be it. I think it's obvious that there's biases out there, and I'm not going to shy away from pointing that out.